Today, I would like to talk to you about canal preparation, and specifically, I would like to talk to you about finishing criteria. In other words, how does a colleague know when they've used a series of instruments or a single instrument to shape a canal, how can they be confident that their work is done and the canal is ready to be disinfected in preparation for three-dimensional obturation? Today, I'd like to talk about the finishing criteria using specifically the ProTaper rotary file system. Notice we have 5 finishing instruments. Again, you may have heard this in other segments or read it or been to my website, but I'll review the geometries just briefly. Starting at the left, the yellow band on the handle is a 2007. The red band is a 2508. The blue band is a 3009. The double black is a 4006, and the double yellow is a 5005. But specifically, the tapers I gave you are only between D1 and D3. That's the fixed taper. Behind the fixed taper, from D4 to D16, are decreasing percentage tapers, again, to improve flexibility and to not over-prepare the coronal 2/3 of the canal. By decreasing the percentage tapers, we maximize remaining dentin, and these instruments work dominantly towards their apical extents. So how do we know when we're through? If you have followed the lessons that I have been teaching regarding the ProTaper shaping concept, then the first finishing instrument is a 2007. And once we pull out a 2007 from any given canal, we would irrigate, recapitulate with a tin file just to break up debris and to move that debris into solution, and then we would re-irrigate. Then we would gauge with a 2002 hand file. There is only one thing these two instruments have in common. They're both 0.2 of a millimeter at D0. One instrument has a 7% taper, that's the shaper, but the ISO file has a 2% taper. So in the big graphic, you can see the 2002 is coming down through the canal. It's sloppy loose over length because we're putting a 2% tapered instrument into a 7% hole at least. So if the instrument snugs in at the terminus, this file confirms that the preparation objectives have been met and the canal has been properly shaped. Now you still need to follow disinfection protocols in preparation for three-dimensional obturation, but at least the shaping exercise is done. What if, in fact, you place a 2002, you tap on the handle coronally, and the instrument is loose at length? This simply means that the foramen is bigger than 0.2 of a millimeter. In this instance, I would ask the assistant to hand me a red-handled 2502 tapered instrument. If the 2502 is snug at length, my shape is done. It's that simple. However, what if the 2502 comes in and it's short of the foramen? Well, not to make this overly difficult, but what this means in a very simple way is the foramen is certainly bigger than 0.2 of a millimeter, but it's smaller than 0.25 of a millimeter. This means to me, Ruddle should move to the next rotary instrument, so red follows yellow, and I would carry the 2508 file to length. Again, once that file is carried to length in one or more passes, the instrument is removed. Irrigate, recapitulate, and re-irrigate. With a cleaned canal, gauge with a 2502. Again, there's only one thing in common between these two instruments. They're D0 diameters. The diameter at the end of the file is 1/4 of a millimeter. So if the 2502 slides through length and is snug at the terminus, your shape is completed, and you can be quite confident that you don't need to think about shaping. You now need to focus on disinfecting and three-dimensional obturation, which lies just ahead. On the other hand, if you slide the 2502 into the canal and it's loose at length, it simply means the foramen is bigger than a 2502 hand file. So let's try the blue 3002 tapered hand file. And you're starting to get the idea. If the 3002 is snug at length, our shape is done. Again, to be redundant, if the 3002 is short of length, we can say the same two things. First, the foramen is bigger than a 2502 hand file, but it is less than a 3002, and that's why the 3002 is short. So when the 3002 is short, it reminds me to go to the next larger sequential protaper rotary shaping file, and that would be the blue 3009. A word of caution. When you're carrying bigger D0 files with bigger apical third tapers around curvature, you're making a more direct path to the terminus. The cautionary note is to remind you that working length is always decreasing as we shape around curvatures. We want to keep the rotary files inside the body of the canal. So it's wise to reconfirm working length in more curved canals so that we don't inadvertently tear or rip the foramen. Once we've pulled the 3009 out of the canal, irrigate, recapitulate, re-irrigate, and gauge the foramen with a 3002. If it's snug at length, the shape is confirmed and is done. If in fact we tap on the handle and the file is loose at length, you can get from the previous discussions how we would advance going on to the double yellow 5005 and if necessary the double black handle 4006. This would represent more or less the finishing criteria for any rotary file, but specifically I'm emphasizing the finishing criteria for the ProTaper rotary file system. There's been a lot of controversy in clinical endodontics over the last 3 or 4 years about how large to prepare the apical terminal part of the canal. These confusing discussions and debates have conjured up a lot of misinformation and misconceptions in the endodontic marketplace. And in fact, there's a lot of disagreements, even among academics, in terms of how large to prepare the apical foramen. Sadly, many researchers and academicians chose to prepare the foramen to a 40 or larger because they had two ideas or concepts. One was they needed to make the foramen large to make sure the foramen was indeed round. They did not want an irregular shaped foramen. They wanted a round foramen, which meant the file included all the ramifications off the rounder part of the canal. The second reason for advocating large apical sizes was to ensure that reagent or irrigant would exchange to the full length. Well, both of these concepts and ideas, although I have respect for the people that advocate them, I do not agree with their conclusions. And Baumgartner, one of our most brilliant researchers in North America, recently retired from the Oregon Health Science Center and is living happily, I understand, in Hawaii. He showed in the Journal of Endodontics in June of 2004 that if you look at the graphic on the left, that is a 4006 preparation. Notice at D1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the file is uniformly getting bigger by 0.06 of a millimeter. So that's a fixed tapered 4006 prep. Baumgartner showed that a 4006 preparation is no cleaner than a 2010 preparation. So let's look at the graphic on the right. You can see there's a little bit of difference in the apical extent of treatment, but what you notice immediately is that there's a file that's 0.2 of a millimeter at its terminus, and the file has a 10% taper. It's getting bigger by 1/10 of a millimeter every 1 millimeter we back out of the canal. So what was so interesting and fascinating about this well-designed study is that a 4006, if you compare it to a 2010 prep, they were both statistically significantly as clean comparing the two preps together. One was not cleaner than the other. One was not dirtier than the other. The other important thing to come back to is most students have historically been taught through traditional education to work about a millimeter short of length. The last 1 millimeter of any canal oftentimes can be highly curved. It can bifurcate, sometimes trifurcate into multiple apical portals of exit. So I really don't agree with a short prep because when you go through a series of instruments somewhat short of length, we begin to create what has been affectionately called a seat for the master cone, but this is none other than a ledge. And you know how we as dentists hate ledges anywhere along in the body of the canal. Well, whether it's an iatrogenic ledge in a curvature or it's an intentionally created ledge apically, these are serious problems to overcome. And the problem with a ledge is oftentimes mud is delivered deep apical to the ledge, and we have a block canal and a ledge. If you imagine sliding a cone to length and mud has accumulated in the apical seat of the image on the left, you can see that the cone wouldn't meet the 1 millimeter level. And when the cone is short, many colleagues, in their efforts to recapture the vertical extent of treatment, have ended up dealing with a blocked and ledge canal. This takes an enormous amount of time, oftentimes, to overcome and to smooth this out and recapture the desired working length. The image on the right is the workaround. Schilder always trains students to have a smooth flowing preparation from the terminus to the orifice. If the cone fits long, in this case, it's a simple adjustment of trimming the cone. 2 or 3 seconds, the cone has now been trimmed and it's now adjusted to fit properly. If the cone is short, it's easier to use a smaller diameter cone that can fit and slide easily through a smooth preparation to length. So because we're off course in endodontic shaping procedures over 90% of the time, like an airplane in flight, the airplane in flight is constantly making adjustments, and so it is clinically. We're always making adjustments so that we can have a smooth, safe arrival at our destination, the terminus of the canal. Take into account Baumgartner's study and begin to think of your own clinical experience, and it might suggest a new method and level for preparing canals and how we might finish these canals. So we were told to make them big to make them round, but ironically the same researcher in another paper published in '87 showed at length that the uninstrumented portions of the canal were actually cleaner than the instrumented portions. Hearing it initially, you're thinking this is ridiculous. But if you give it a little bit more thought, what I just said would be very logical and would make total sense. In other words, where an instrument actually works, it's cutting dentin. The byproduct of cutting dentin is mud. So where the instrument is actually working and cutting, the byproduct is the smear layer. Baumgartner showed that the uninstrumented portions, where the file never touched, never had a smear layer. So that's what he meant when he said that the uninstrumented portions at length were cleaner than the instrument portions. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to use this information in a very appropriate way, clinical, so you don't have to take great big files needlessly into the apical 1/3 and to length, because big files, regardless if they're stainless steel or NiTi, they're going to be stiffer, and these stiffer instruments begin to create a lot of mud. We block a lot of the lateral anatomy, and we begin to have discussions about transportation of the physiologic terminus to a new iatrogenic location on the external root surface. So we've looked at a couple slides that should give you some confidence to keep your foramens as small as practical. If we were to look at some of the evidence for the pro-taper shapes that can be expected using the techniques that we've just discussed, and some of the other segments that I've talked about previously, let's look at a published article in a peer-reviewed journal. And you can begin to see that these images, Ruddle did the shapes, but the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium did the micro-CT work, and here we go. The image on the left is the straight-on view. That's the image that you would pretty much see clinically. Notice the furcal side concavity. You can get a hint of it. The distal root has been removed to simplify the research. If you rotate the image on the left 90 degrees, you can appreciate more fully how deep the furcal side concavity invaginates into that root surface. The green image here is nothing more than a image showing the original root canal system anatomy of the MB and ML. And you can notice these are merging systems, and there is some webbing between the merging systems in the apical 1/3. So green is before Ruddle. Here we have 3 columns of images, and on the far left you can see we're doing a slice horizontally through about the level of the pulp chamber. In the middle series of images, green is on top, that's before Ruddle, and then red is the image below it, and that's after Ruddle. So what you can do is use 4 Gates Gliddens, 2, you could use the X gates, the auxiliary X gates in the access kit by Dentsply MyFair. Or 3, you could use the ProTaper Shaper X to relocate the orifice away from furcal danger. And that's what's happened in the bottom image in the middle. And then, of course, the right image is nothing more than a superimposition of Ruddle's work over green, the original image in the middle on the top. Now that you're more oriented, we can look more quickly at the rest of the images. The left image is always the section where we do the horizontal section. You can see in the middle series of images, green is before, red is after Ruddle. So again, we're brushing away from furcal danger to intentionally relocate the canal away from a furcal side concavity. And again, you can see the far image on the right with the superimposition of red over green showing the work that we can do again with either 4 Gates Gliddens, Shaper X, or the auxiliary X gates that is very useful to expand the canal orifice, to remove triangles of Denton, and to marry that orifice to the smooth axial walls. If we look at a zone or a region of our work, you can look from the top down or the bottom up, but you can see that we're intentionally relocating the orifice in this region of the canal away from the furcal side concavity. And again, to be terribly redundant, there's 3 concepts or 3 ideas that we've talked about. You can use 4 GGs, big to small, or you can use the auxiliary X gates, which has 4 GGs on a single instrument, or you could use Shaper X in the ProTaper family of instruments. If you look at a middle slice, right through the root, perpendicular to the long axis, again in the middle images, green is before, bottom image, red is after. Look at the red is perfectly circumscribing and including green, and our preparation is centered in the mesial distal dimensions of the mesial root. If you look at a voxel of that work, notice how red is perfectly circumscribed in including green in a very symmetrical way. Very thrilling work with the ProTaper. This, remember, is an active file that can stay centered. And finally, there were thousands of images done, hundreds were evaluated, and a few were published. But in a representative apical 1/3 slice, you can see that the foramen has been included completely with the ProTaper instruments, and it's including it, and it's round, it's symmetrical, there's no ripping, no tearing, no transportation. So if you look at before on the left, and you look at red on the right, this is important to state. This was a mechanical study only. We used water as the intracanal reagent. We did not use sodium hypochlorite. And what we're showing is something that changed how International Endodontics looked at NiTi files. It had been published in many different journals that when NiTi instruments are employed, that they only engage about 50 to 60% of the internal walls of the canal. Well, you can look at the image on the left, that's the original image, and then you can see the work of 3 ProTaper files, purple, white, and yellow, and I think you would agree that the ProTaper 3 instruments probably touched about 90% of the internal walls of the canal. The secret is brushing. We were the first file system in the world, ProTaper, where we advocated a brushing concept to brush into the eccentricities off the rounder parts of canals. By brushing off the rounder parts of canals, you bring the instrument intimately against dentin, and you can include more wall contact. You can notice in the webbing between the merging systems in a water study, obviously pulp is not going to be removed from that area of the canal, and you can see a few other limited areas where the ProTaper instruments did not contact dentin. If we look at the other view from the lingual side, you can see a very similar result. Again, probably more than 90% of the internal walls have been engaged and cut. The secret was using the shapers in a brushing motion. Shaping is the secret to success with ProTaper because by brushing we make lateral space, but biologically we do a better job by brushing because we contact more walls and we remove more pulp tissue and we open up more lateral canals and tubules to the possibility that active disinfection can reach into those areas and clean the uninstrumentable portions of the root canal system. In summary, I would like to re-emphasize this lesson on the finishing criteria. Hopefully you learned that we don't have to arbitrarily machine out foramina to large sizes. Let's remember Schilderian endodontics, and one of the mechanical objectives was keep the foramen as small as practical. In this lesson, I think we learned the importance of taper as it relates to the size of the prepared apical foramen.